Thank you. Please take your seats. Good morning all, Madam First Lady, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends of Rwanda. Welcome to the 31 International Conference of Kwibuka. My name is Ariane Nhesha, and it is once again my honor to serve you as your Master of Ceremonies. We gather here in Kigali, 31 years after the genocide against the Tutsi, not just to remember, but to confront the continued presence of the danger of genocide ideology. This year's theme, One Never Again Fails, Continuation of Genocide Ideology, is a sobering reminder that remembrance must go hand in hand with responsibility and action. We open today's conference with reflections and insights from key voices, those who have walked alongside Rwanda's path to justice, peace, and vigilance. We thank you all. We encourage you to engage deeply, to listen actively, and to reflect on how each of us can respond to the call of Kwibuka, not only today, but every day. To begin our program, it is my honor to invite Honorable Dr. Jean Damascene Bizimana, Minister of National Unity and Civic Engagement, to deliver the keynote address. Thank you.
Excellences, la Première Dame, Mesdames, Mesdemoiselles, Messieurs, tout honneur respecté, good morning, bonjour, mwaramutse. Permettez-moi de prime abord de souhaiter les bienvenus à Kigali aux invités, panélistes et participants qui nous sont venus de loin. J'espère que vous avez eu un beau voyage, une agréable nuit et que vous allez avoir un beau séjour au Rwanda. Nous entamons demain la 31e commémoration du génocide perpétré contre les Tutsis au Rwanda en 1994. Cette conférence s'inscrit d'une part dans le respect de la mémoire et d'autre part dans la mise en application de la résolution de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies du 23 décembre 2003, modifiée le 26 janvier 2018, qui a consacré la date du 7 avril comme, je cite, une journée internationale de réflexion sur le génocide des Tutsis au Rwanda en 1994. Il y a une règle sur laquelle nous sommes tous d'accord. C'est que s'il n'y avait pas eu une ingérence européenne en Afrique et au Rwanda en particulier, nous ne serions pas en train de faire une conférence comme celle-ci sur un génocide ayant emporté plus d'1 million de personnes tuées pour ce qu'elles étaient. Je le dis avec conviction en me référant aux propres écrits des premiers missionnaires arrivés au Rwanda qui ont décrit une société unie et unifiée. Je cite 2 exemples. Le premier ouvrage, celui des missionnaires catholiques publié à Kigali en 1930, chanoine Louis Doragère, intitulé « Le Rwanda ancien et moderne », dans lequel il s'émerveille devant l'unité des Rwandais en ces termes, je le cite, « Les indigènes de ce pays ont bien le sentiment de ne former qu'un seul peuple, celui des Rwandais, qui a donné son nom au territoire. Ce sentiment prend la forme qu'il revêt normalement chez les sédentaires d'attachement au sol, non pas seulement au foyer, à la commune ou à la province et au territoire ancien, obéissant au même prince. Le patriotisme se traduit dans l'attachement à la dynastie régnante. Fin de citation. Le second ouvrage, c'est un ouvrage historique bien connu, écrit par un père blanc, Albert Pagès, en 1933, intitulé « Un royaume hamite au centre de l'Afrique ». Voici ce qu'il dit à propos de l'unité des Rwandais. Les Rwandais étaient persuadés, avant la pénétration européenne, que leur pays était le centre du monde, le plus puissant et le plus civilisé de toute la terre. Il faut ajouter l'unité linguistique qui, presque absolue d'un bout à l'autre du territoire, conditionne la facilité des relations entre les habitants, l'unité des institutions de coutume et d'usage dans la vie privée, la vie sociale et la vie publique, entre concitoyens de conditions différentes et enfin l'unité religieuse. Mesdames et messieurs, une société unie de ce point, telle que les premiers Blancs l'ont trouvée, ne pouvait en aucun cas aboutir à un génocide si ces valeurs n'avaient pas été détruites par les occupants blancs pour leurs propres intérêts. En peu de mots, l'origine profonde du génocide des Tutsis se trouve dans la colonisation belge qui a détruit l'identité existentielle du Rwandais. Après, la Belgique a idéologisé des partis politiques rwandais, tels parmi Hutu et Aprosoma, qui ont poursuivi l'œuvre ravageur de la colonisation. C'est finalement l'élite rwandaise, au niveau politique, universitaire, militaire, religieuse, société civile et autres, formée dans ce système discriminatoire belge qui a pensé intellectuellement le génocide. Nous estimons que cette conférence permettra particulièrement aux jeunes de comprendre le modus operandi de ce génocide qui a été un crime soigneusement conçu, élaboré et commis au nom d'une idée, d'une idéologie ethniciste et politique. Le moment de cette conférence est important car nous voyons la résurgence dans notre région des mêmes idées, des mêmes idéologies et des mêmes complicités comme celles qui ont eu libre cours au Rwanda entre 1990 et 1994. Ces événements se manifestent par la falsification des faits, le détournement des responsabilités, la criminalisation des victimes et la sanctification des bourreaux. Pire encore, nous observons le négationnisme grandir en Europe, notamment en Belgique, où il se déroule impunément. En France, ce crime est réprimé sur instruction du parquet, comme on l'a vu en décembre 2024, avec la condamnation de Charles Onana pour le négationnisme du génocide des Tutsis. Une première en dehors du territoire rwandais, nous nous en félicitons profondément. De nos jours, nous observons l'apparition d'actes acceptés par des États visant le sabotage des commémorations du génocide commis contre les Tutsis. C'est le cas en Belgique, où des villes comme Bruges et Liège, qui est la plus grande ville francophone belge, interdisent les commémorations publiques du génocide des Tutsis. C'est un scandale, d'autant plus que la Belgique, quand elle diabolise le Rwanda, sous prétexte d'un conflit strictement interne qui se déroule sur le territoire congolais, avance qu'elle le fait en application du droit international. Or, l'établissement du droit du génocide des Tutsis est aussi un acquis du droit international consacré par les instances internationales habilitées. L'Assemblée générale de l'ONU en 2003, je l'ai dit au début, et le Conseil de sécurité en 2014 ont voté des résolutions consacrant l'obligation de commémoration pour tous les États membres de l'ONU. Nous voyons près du Rwanda des actes de reprise du génocide sur le même groupe ethnique Tutsi et Banyamulenge en République démocratique du Congo sur ordre du pouvoir. Des actes d'appel à la haine et d'incitation directe et publique à commettre le génocide sont lancés par des officiels. Ils se propagent au vu et au su du monde entier, en violation totale des dispositions de la Convention sur le génocide. Le présent colloque vient donc à point nommé pour s'y plonger et montrer que l'obligation de prévention du génocide dont se vantent certains États doit être réellement traduite dans la matérialité des faits, pas dans des discours vides. En deuxième lieu, l'importance de ce colloque réside dans le constat montrant la mansuétude que des États et organisations internationales et leurs services, comme la MONUSCO, accordent aux groupes génocidaires, les FDLR. Ce groupe, constitué d'éléments coupables de génocide, est recru et ouvertement condamné par l'ONU dans différentes résolutions. Or, ce même groupe terroriste est aujourd'hui toléré et sanctifié par les mêmes instances. L'aveuglement va jusqu'à inclure les FDLR dans l'armée régulière congolaise, à côté des milices wazalendo, rappelant les Interahamwe et impuzamugambi de triste mémoire au Rwanda. La sympathie criminelle va jusqu'au point de tolérer l'emploi des mercenaires européens, agissant impunément sous le regard complice de la MONUSCO. Le Rwanda, dans sa transparence habituelle, les a laissés rentrer tranquillement. La presse occidentale n'a pas du tout parlé de cet événement, alors que l'usage des mercenaires est interdit par les conventions de Genève du 9 août 1949 et les protocoles additionnels du 6 juin 1977. 31 ans viennent de s'écouler sans que la même communauté internationale, jadis coupable de l'abandon du Rwanda, ne dit aucun mot quant au sort des réfugiés congolais chassés de chez eux par les FDLR depuis juillet 1994. Plus de 900 000 réfugiés congolais, Tutsis, ont quitté leur pays, leur territoire, leur domicile et résident dans des camps au Rwanda, en Ouganda et dans différents pays à travers le monde. Les crimes qu'ils ont subis sont mondialement connus, mais restent impunis. Peut-on alors dire que le génocide des Tutsis a appris quelque chose à la communauté internationale? C'est une bonne question à laquelle cette conférence doit faire le débat. Pour mieux se dédouaner, certains États et organisations internationales, comme le Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU, le Parlement européen, pour ne citer que cela, ont créé un bouc émissaire qui s'appelle le Rwanda. Le leitmotiv quotidien retenu dans la presse internationale est celui-ci: mouvement rebelle M23 soutenu par le Rwanda. Rien sur les raisons pour lesquelles ce groupe existe et pour lesquelles il se bat. Or, on ne peut pas prévenir un génocide, on ne peut pas mettre fin à un conflit sans en analyser les causes et adopter des solutions propres aux vraies causes. Ces États et organisations ont aussi trouvé des raccourcis avec des mots insensés, en l'espèce, qui trompent les non-avertis, comme balkanisation, souveraineté, intégrité du territoire, exploitation des minerais, et j'en passe. Ces États feignent d'ignorer que le respect intégral du droit international se trouve dans le respect de toutes les souverainetés nationales, pas seulement uniquement celle de la République démocratique du Congo. Le respect du droit international se trouve aussi dans la neutralisation des FDLR et dans la recherche des solutions définitives permettant au Rwanda d'obtenir le respect de son territoire et aux réfugiés congolais de retrouver pacifiquement et durablement le sol de leurs ancêtres. Voilà une simple analyse que des États ne font pas ou refusent sciemment de faire, mais qui s'imposent. Allant vers la fin de mon allocution, qu'il me soit permis de rappeler qu'à la fin du génocide des Tutsis, en juillet 1994, nous avions vu naître l'espoir de plusieurs décisions internationales courageuses qui faisaient rêver un lendemain meilleur. Il y a eu d'abord la création du tribunal pénal international pour le Rwanda par la résolution 955 du Conseil de sécurité le 8 novembre 1994. Malgré des erreurs et manquements de ce tribunal, nous sommes d'avis qu'il a accompli un travail historique de taille par l'établissement judiciaire de l'évidence du génocide commis contre les Tutsis. En 1999, l'Organisation des Nations Unies a mis en place une commission dirigée par Ingvar Carlsson, ancien Premier ministre de Suède, qui a rendu son rapport le 15 décembre 1999, reconnaissant des manquements graves de l'ONU dans la prévention du génocide des Tutsis. Voici un extrait de ses conclusions. C'est sur le système des Nations Unies tout entier que retombe la responsabilité de n'avoir su ni prévenir ni mettre fin au génocide au Rwanda. La carence première a consisté à ne pas mobiliser les ressources et l'engagement politique qu'appelaient les événements du Rwanda et la présence des Nations Unies dans le pays. Les États membres ont persisté à ne pas témoigner de la volonté politique voulue et à se refuser d'agir de façon suffisamment résolue. Fin de citation. L'Union européenne, l'Union africaine a également créé une commission le 21 novembre 1997, présidée par l'ancien président du Botswana, Ketumire Masire, laquelle a produit en mai 2000 un rapport portant un titre éloquent, je cite, « Un génocide qu'on aurait pu éviter ». Je cite le constat. La vérité qui émerge de notre enquête est indiscutablement que le génocide qui advint au Rwanda aurait pu être évité par ceux de la communauté internationale qui étaient en position et avaient les moyens de le faire. Mais la volonté a fait défaut et non pas les moyens. Le monde a abandonné le Rwanda. Fin de citation. Le 7 avril 2000, tout le monde s'en souvient, nous avions cru à l'ouverture d'une nouvelle page de reconnaissance et de responsabilité lorsque le Premier ministre belge Guy Verhofstadt, au stade Amahoro, prononçait sa demande de pardon en ces termes. Un dramatique cortège de négligence, d'insouciance, d'incompétence, d'hésitation et d'erreur a créé les conditions d'une tragédie sans nom. Et donc j'assume ici devant vous la responsabilité de mon pays, des autorités militaires et politiques belges. Et au nom de mon pays, au nom de mon pays, au nom de mon peuple, je vous demande pardon pour cela. Fin de citation. Mesdames, Mesdemoiselles, Mesdames et Messieurs, malgré ces différents aveux de reconnaissance, de responsabilité, nous observons aujourd'hui une renaissance des mêmes fautes que celles pour lesquelles les États avaient demandé pardon. Nous observons une certaine complicité internationale flagrante et un refus troublant de prévention d'un génocide en cours en République démocratique du Congo. C'est comme si les leçons que le monde avait tirées du génocide des Tutsis n'ont plus de raison d'être. Nous ne pouvons pas observer la renaissance d'une idéologie récurrente de banalisation du mal et entrer dans la période de commémoration du génocide des Tutsis, le dernier du XXe siècle, sans nous interroger sur les mobiles de son existence et les voies et moyens de le combattre et de le vaincre, en regardant le passé, le présent et le futur. Je vous souhaite des travaux fructueux au long de cette conférence. Merci.
Merci, honorable ministre, pour ces mots qui appellent à l'action et à la conscience. We are now going to move to our first panel of the day, titled Sounding the Alarm, the Persistence of Genocide Ideology. The ideology that led to the genocide against the Tutsi did not vanish in 1994, as Honorable Minister just had reminded us. It has simply changed form through denial, distortion, recruitment, and persecution. This panel will examine how genocide ideology continues to spread, especially in our region, and explore strategies to confront it and dismantle it. I will now call our moderator for this session, Dr. Doris Picard, CEO of the Rwanda Governance Board. Joining her are our esteemed panelists, Dr. Alice Nderitu, former UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Florida Kabasinga, founder and managing partner of Sartolo and former ICTR prosecutor, Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo, author and leading voice on Rwanda's post-genocide transformation, and Dr. Alice Mvuka Tung, researcher and analyst on the Great Lakes region. Thank you, and I now hand over to Dr. Doris Picard.
Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam First Lady, very glad to be with you today. All protocols observed. And I would like to welcome you to this critical panel where we discuss this critical panel discussion on sounding the alarm, the persistence of genocide denial and genocide ideology. 31 years after the genocide against the Tutsi, we are confronted with the hard truth that never again remains an unfulfilled promise. Genocide ideology has not disappeared. In fact, it has merely evolved, relocated to new geographical locations beyond Rwanda's borders, and it has adapted to the new mediums that are available and continues to manifest through denial, distortion, incitement, and targeted persecution, especially in places like Eastern DRC. Today's conversation is both urgent and necessary. We explore how this ideology survives, what enables it, and most importantly, what must be done to address this. I'm honored to be joined by 4 remarkable individuals whose work has directly engaged with the fight against genocide and its ideological roots. First, we have Madam Alice Nderitu, a respected mediator, author, former United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and she serves as current Global President of Isoko Center for Humanity at Aegis Trust. She has worked extensively across Africa in conflict resolution, genocide prevention, and inclusive peace building, often leading dialogue processes in deeply divided societies. We also have right next to her, Madame Florida Kabasinga, distinguished lawyer, justice advocate, founder and managing partner of Sartolo, a leading litigation advisory firm based in Kigali. She has previously served as prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where she played a critical role in advancing accountability for the genocide against the Tutsi. With her expertise in international criminal justice and human rights, she's been a leading voice in the fight against genocide ideology, legal denialism, and impunity. Her work currently continues to advance survivor-centered justice and uphold the truth of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Right next to her, we have Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo, a political analyst and author known for his groundbreaking research on the genocide against the Tutsis and the Rwanda's post-genocide transformation. His works include Rwanda's Popular Genocide and Transforming Rwanda. And it offers a deep insight into the historical roots of genocide ideology and the challenges encountered in national reconstruction. He is a leading voice in how societies can confront violent pasts while building inclusive and resilient futures. Finally, last but certainly not least, Dr. Alex Mvukantung, leading researcher and analyst specializing in the Great Lakes region of Africa with a focus on conflict, identity, and the persistence of genocide ideology. Born in the DRC, Dr. Ntung brings both personal experience and scholarly insight to his work on regional instability, cross-border violence, and the targeting of Tutsi communities in Eastern DRC. He's widely recognized for his critical analysis of international inaction and his advocacy for truth, justice, and long-term peace building. So thank you very much, esteemed panelists, for taking the time to be with us today. I think we'll start with a discussion, just going back to the roots of it all, of this genocide ideology when it was first confronted, especially with Ms. Florida, who worked, as I mentioned, who worked as a prosecutor at the ICTR. And I would like to just ask of her, from this experience, what patterns did you observe, or rhetorics and strategies used by genocide perpetrators in their defense at the ICTR, or even surrounding their prosecution? How do you see these strategies repeated, these patterns replicated and adopted? How do you see these parallel being drawn today?
First of all, at the ICTR, we had the biggest ideologues of genocide. We had the people who planned the genocide, and therefore the people behind what we see today, the rhetoric that comes out in denial came first from the defense of the ICTR, from what the key ideologues were actually using to defend their actions in 1994. So when you see the arguments that are used today by ideologues, you actually realize a lot of those were the defenses that were used at the ICTR. The first one is about the plane crash. That is usually the biggest defense. And how it was used at the ICTR is that they are not responsible for the genocide, because on the 6th of April, there was a plane crash where the father of the nation was killed by the RPF. And therefore what followed was spontaneous. It was people rising up and doing things. It was not planned, and therefore they are not responsible for the genocide. So when people talk about the plane crash, in fact, it's a way of shifting blame, but it does not explain the fact that the moment the plane crash happened, you see something that has been planned for a long time. There is no explanation for the Interahamwe having been trained, for the Impuzamugambi having been trained as militias, for the lists of Tutsi victims that had been prepared. It does not explain how the genocide immediately was put into action. Immediately you see roadblocks going up. You see key Tutsi figures being killed first, and then later on you see cabinet members being sent from the central government to go out into various parts of Rwanda to actually oversee the genocide. So today the ideologues, when they start talking about plane crash, they are literally trying to confuse everybody. The theory of double genocide, that started at the ICTR. So you create a moral equivalence, and yet we know that the only recognized genocide of what happened in this country that is both legal and factual is the genocide of the Tutsi. And you find some people actually talking about in subtle ways that are nuanced. But it was not only the Tutsi who died. So, while factually true, there are moderate Hutus who died, the reality is genocide has a specific definition. And when you look at it, it's a specific group of people, either ethnic, national, religious. So those are the people that are supposed to be, they are protected. And so what has been recognized is the Tutsi genocide. So when you say, but other people died, what are you trying to do? You're trying to say, since everybody died, there is no genocide against the Tutsi. And that started at the ICTR. When people use language of Rwandan genocide, it's not by accident. And ideologues, to be quite honest, they're very smart people. So when they say Rwandan genocide, that means Rwandans were targeted to be annihilated in 1994, which is not true. And so we must call that out. And that started also with the people at the ICTR. There's something that happens when they say shift the blame. When you're accused of genocide, go on the offensive and try the current government. And that is happening even when we are trying to get perpetrators extradited from different countries. They don't defend themselves for the most part. What they do is try to make it about the current government. They are murderers. You don't know who these people are. And it happens all the time. So those are the subtle ways of how these things are done, and they must be called out. The most important thing to understand is that genocides start through ideology. That's how it begins. Prior to 1994, if the government in this country had actually stopped the ideology and not promoted it, we would not have had 1994. So to be very clear, it is not a matter that is to be taken lightly. So when ideology is accepted and taken lightly, and you are told it's not as serious as it sounds, to be honest, that is not true. We have seen in this country what ideology can lead to. So those are the nuanced ways that people must be aware and look out for, that started with the key ideologues, but are continuing today with people in different parts of the world, and it must be called out whenever it happens.
Thank you very much, Madam Kausinga. And I just want to come to Madam Wairimu a bit, and then just draw these two stark portraits. When Florida mentioned that, you know, the international, when she mentioned the preparation that went behind the genocide, you know, as a counter to the narrative of a spontaneous genocide, at the same time, with the international community, we see that there were alarms sounded almost daily, right? And I want to contrast that with the picture of, I think you've all, to some extent, been to the memorial, the Gisozi Genocide Memorial. When you got into the area of the children, which is actually the most heartbreaking area, when they're talking about the children, there's that one child that tells their mother, don't worry, UNAMIR is going to rescue us. So on one hand, we have the international community that knows, has been warned repeatedly that a genocide is in place, is being prepared. Genocide ideology has taken root. On the other, there is this trust in Rwanda that international systems, international human rights systems will offer some level of protection. So to you, Ms. Wairimu, you've worked at a global level to prevent atrocities, but yet we see them keep being repeated at an alarming rate. The genocide in Rwanda against the Tutsis was not the last genocide that we've experienced. What are the key failures or gaps you've observed in how international systems detect and respond to persistent genocide ideology? And how do you see a way to address these failings? Because at some point it just seems very endemic and intractable. What can be changed?
Thank you very much. And here we are commemorating the 31st, when we remember the genocide against the Tutsi. And it brings my mind to times at which the international community said never again. And we know that after the Second World War, how horrified everybody was, especially when the horrors of the Holocaust began to come out. And that led to the 1948 Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And the whole world saying, no, this can never happen again. And an outpouring of support for those efforts, with Ethiopia being the first country to ratify the Genocide Convention, with lots of legislation coming up in Latin America. And then we fast forward to the 1994, a genocide happened in this country against the Tutsi. A genocide happened in Srebrenica against the Bosniak Muslims. And again, we came to another never again moment where international mobilization in terms of what do we do to ensure that this never happens again. And I remember, because the genocide against the Tutsi, it's a genocide that happened in living memory. I personally had already graduated from the University of Nairobi, and I remember vividly what was happening at that time and how it had been made very clear through early warning signs, especially by newspapers, journalists. They were writing, the Tutsis are being killed, the Tutsis are being targeted. So even those of us who didn't have information that the international organizations had at that time, that we knew that there was a genocide, there was something, there was massive mass killing. We didn't have the word genocide then, but we knew there was mass killing against the Tutsi. So the African Union put together legal frameworks in this never again moment to ensure that another genocide like happened against the Tutsi did not happen, put in place the ICGLR protocol with all these frameworks. The countries in the Great Lakes region are all supposed to have prevention of genocide committees that speak to ensuring that a genocide that happened against the Tutsi doesn't happen again. Europe has all these frameworks, the EU has frameworks. Many countries in Europe that already had Holocaust laws in terms of denying the Holocaust expanded them to speak to genocide prevention as well. But we are at a moment when we ask ourselves, so how good are these laws? How good are these legislative frameworks? When we can't speak to specific facts. And one specific fact being, and I'm glad that Florida worked at the ICTR, because one of the things that the ICTR did was indict more than 1,000 people. I don't remember the actual number. What I know is that more than 1,000 people are still living free. People indicted for the genocide against the Tutsi here in Rwanda. And that 500 of them, over 500 of them, 530 of them are living in the DRC. And if these people are living in the DRC, indicted by a UN tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and they are living free, what then does never again mean? Why aren't we all mobilized and trying to establish where those people are and trying to pressure the governments that are protecting them so that those people face trial? Why does the international community need to ask itself, like, you cannot condone living next to a bicycle thief, but you can condone living next to somebody who planned and implemented the killing of millions of people or thousands of people. So there is actually a failure in terms of implementation and in terms of what really needs to be done. So in terms of genocide ideology, we do know for a fact, those of us who worked in this field, that people who have been targeted for genocide before are 3 times higher at risk to be targeted again, which is why you see this genocide ideology going on and on. which is why we see that that when the people who are being killed in DRC, you've seen the videos of people being burnt and eaten alive. So when a Congolese Tutsi says that they are being killed in the DRC, then you see the role of genocide ideology in that they blame the victim instead of blaming the people who are killing. We don't ask ourselves as an international community, do we actually think those 500, more than 500 indicted people went to the DRC and just sat there? Do we think that when they went there and found the Congolese Tutsi there, that they thought that now they'll start coexisting with them? Why do we not understand, why do we not address the root causes? And there's a failure of the international community of the fact of the existence of the FDLR. Why is there consistent overplaying, including international media, underplaying the role of the FDLR and saying the FDLR is not as powerful as it used to be? Why is it not powerful when it has an ideology and it has more than 500 people indicted by the ICTR who know how to actually execute a genocide and who are now living in that space? So in terms of frameworks, there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of political will. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of knowledge, actual knowledge of genocide ideology. How many countries in the world are actually teaching genocide ideology? How many each time when in my previous position, when I used to talk about risk factors for genocide, even to people who work within the international system, I would be surprised by how little people know. If you ask somebody, what are the risk factors for genocide in any specific space? What needs to be present for a genocide to happen? You'll be surprised how many little people know about that. So we may have laws, we may have frameworks, we may have policies, but in terms of implementation, we must ask the hard questions. And we must be prepared to ask hard questions of governments. We must be prepared to say that a life in Africa or a life in any other part of the world is as important as a life, for example, in Europe. We need to ensure that the international frameworks, the international human rights institutions speak to those specific lives as if one person, for example, had been killed, say, in Paris today. We need to speak to that particular aspect. So education still continues to be huge. It continues to be something that needs to be done, but what kind of education? And also we must stop framing never again as something episodic. You know, it comes and goes. Then we wait for the next genocide, then we are all running around and setting up tribunals and saying, no, this will never happen again, and then it happens again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for even this emphasis on implementation. We have all the legal frameworks available to prevent, and I've seen your former office had also developed sort of an alarm system, you know, key identifiers that genocidal ideology is being implemented in certain countries. And it comes back also to what Florida was talking about, the defenses that were being used at the ICTR, forming part of the genocide ideology that we see today. And I'd like to just come to Dr. Kimonyo on this aspect where, yes, we have this genocide ideology, right? Yes, we have these international, but these are enabled by systems that are in place, either national, regional, international. And you've worked on, you've had this research in Rwanda's history, and you have a very deep understanding of the societal and structural conditions that allowed the genocide ideology to flourish before 1994. What warning signs do you see repeated in these conditions? And I wouldn't want you to limit yourself to just the conditions within Rwanda, but even within the international community. What do you see repeated today that is enabling this continued persecution of Tutsis in the region?
Thank you very much, Doris. First, I would like to maybe say that the ideology of genocide before '94 was not flourishing in Rwanda society as such. I think that we have a kind of distorted perspective because of what happened and finally happened at the end of the process. We have the impression that this intense mobilization of the population was there for a very long time. That's not true. Before 94, the population itself was not that much in that ideology. One of the maybe most important example or proof of that, when the genocide started on the 7th of April, in many communities, Hutu and Tutsis went together and tried to fight off the Interahamwe. Because at the time, what was most important was the war between political parties. And those who engineered or initiated the genocide had to make, they had a meeting here on the 11th of April to clarify the situation and send people all over the country to tell them this is not the war between parties, this is the war against Tutsis. That's one thing. Second, the ideology of genocide was dormant in certain ways, but also very present in Rwandan society, but in very specific pockets. The first one, especially after 1990, with democratization, it was political, among political parties and political activists. They are the ones who were the carriers of the ideology of genocide. And second, there was also, and which is very important, now I'm talking about on the grassroots level, all over the country, but especially not that much in the north, but in the rest of the country. The children of Parmehutu propagandists, those who carried out the revolution of 1959, their children often were the big relay of the genocide ideology at the time. So it was dormant, but also it was also beneath the, I will say, the foundation of the Rwandan polity at the time, since 1594, since 1959 up to 94. So it was there. And often, sometimes there was some declaration by some political leaders that tried to remember people that indeed this is the country of Hutus and Tutsis are only tolerated as long as they keep their place, the place that we gave them. So this was beneath, and it was kind of the foundation of the Rwanda polity at the time. Signs. The first sign is when Rwandans try to challenge that political order. And that's when this ideology came out very strongly, because it was beneath that system. And this is Rwanda. But now, internationally, if you talk about signs or manifestation of the idea of genocide, I will say that it's passivity, first and foremost, passivity. We've seen it when the genocide started as such, but even before the genocide. UN was here, there was international committee was involved here, but they never worked very, they never did anything very strongly to try to stop the idea of genocide that started very strongly starting in 1992. But maybe I would like to go a bit further in answering your question. Often we are carried away by the manifestation of the ideology of genocide, the ugliness of the ethnic rhetoric, and sometimes the killings here and there before the genocide started itself. But we have to know that beyond this manifestation of ethnic hatred, the ideology of genocide is first and foremost a political project. It's a political project that wants to change fundamentally the nature of the state and the nature of society. Designing a number of groups as illegitimate and other groups as legitimate. And by the time that the ideology become a fully fledged ideology of genocide, it's not only a question now of excluding, it becomes a question of eliminating. But beyond that, beyond this ethnic rhetoric, there is a very precise political project and a radical one. And it has been the case for every big genocide that the world has experienced all over the world. And sometimes also, this ideology can be also regional. In certain countries, or certainly in the situation that we have today, this ideology is mostly regional. But then political entrepreneurs at the national level also embark on this ideology of genocide for very precise political interests. So I think that there is a genocide as such. There is what can push people to participate in genocide, but idea of genocide is most and foremost a political project. And one of the problems with the international community or different instruments that have been put up to try to combat the genocide, this political project is not taken seriously. Often, internationally, people tend to react in a humanitarian manner, but they don't see the political project behind the ideology of genocide. And I think that's maybe what is the most important problem. And at the end of the day, people have to make a choice. Are they supporting this political project or not?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Kimonyo. And you mentioned, you talk about how genocide ideology is first and foremost a political project that people then embrace, which brings me to Dr. Ntung. On this aspect of it being a political project, we've been actually, as a Rwandan, kind of completely flabbergasted to hear officials from other countries, especially DRC, repeating almost verbatim the same genocide ideology rhetoric that was used against the Tutsis in Rwanda pre-1994, calling people vermins, calling for their extermination, calling them infiltrators and foreigners. And I'm just wondering, I understand it being part of the political project, but you see it being embraced not just by their constituents, but also by the diaspora and spreading it all over. The Hamitic project conspiracy actually has spread all over the diaspora, and people are trying to find equivalents in their own countries where they would say, well, what is the equivalent of Tutsis in our countries? And it's kind of worrying that the scale that it has taken. So I just wanted to discuss, if you could just enlighten us, how is the geography of hate changing so much to the extent that we see it succeeding? What are these strategies that are being used to mobilize genocidal ideology across national borders?
Thank you. I'm going to bring some nuances to what we understand already about the model of relocation of genocide. It's a shift really from my initial thinking that there have been a journey of a genocide from one point to another. And I would see rather an interconnected genocide, a regional genocide. I think we need to remove the borders in our mind and look at the region as a country of nations. What do I mean by this? The definition of genocide, there's so many things that are wrong with it. But it does talk about the intention to destroy a whole or a part, a national, a racial, religious, and ethnic group. And with that in mind, there is an assumption that that sort of grouping, that sort of categorization is within a national boundary, a national country, a country. And of course, genocide is le crime de l'État, a state crime. And when it's state crime, already remove the idea of other states being involved within one genocide. So what I see is a really question of, has the genocide against the Tutsis, it is same genocide. It is one genocide ideology, and therefore it does really confuse us to think that this is the path of a genocide. The journey geographically, it is rather a journey in history. There are some internal causes within different countries, but with really using same ideology. And I see the region as a house, and a house with the rooms, and where there is a virus, a huge virus affecting the whole house, and where one room might be able to get rid of the virus, but the virus is still within the house. And it's almost similar to the doctrine of atomic bomb, of mutual assured destruction. If one house is not safe, one room is not safe, all rooms are not safe. That's what is going on in this region. So what do I mean by this? The region has a shared history. This was the only area that was colonized as Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. It is the area where there have been ethnicity manipulation by colonial leaders. We heard about it from the minister today. And it is the same place where there have been colonial narratives, which you just mentioned, rightly mentioned, about racial theories of Hamithic hypothesis, us versus them, making Tutsis as others, invaders, settlers, name it. And those narratives were everywhere in this region. This is the area where there have been really kind of a racialization. This is a black on black racism. It isn't tribalism. It isn't ethnicism. It is racism. Racism, another form of racism between black people. That's what we're seeing in the DRC. So what has changed from, if we start kind of an initial understanding that is not a genocide that's moved from one place to another. It is the same genocide within a house. And hence why when they are critical, the international community are critical about Rwanda, complaining about what's going on, it is because it's affected within the house. There's no one room that's going to be safe if one other room are still fueling the same ideology. No, moving from there, what has changed so far, to come back to your question, we've seen whether, intensification by social media. During the 1994 Rwandan genocide, if there was a possibility to film everything that was going on, we probably will know much more of the intent of what went on. So we're seeing, lynching, cannibalism in Eastern Congo, use the same rhetorics that used here in 1994, and we're seeing somehow a phenomenon of inflicting much more pain. I'm not trying to undermine what went on here, but I think we're seeing it much. Is the visibility of seeing the inflictions of pain in the victim body. When we saw, video of people being eaten in Kalima, in Manyema area, the eating is not really the eating flesh of human being. Is not about some kind of a tribal or primitive type of a tradition of eating human flesh. It is really sending a message of humiliating the relatives. But at the same time, is a feeling that even a dead body is not dead. You're still trying to, inflict pain into the dead body. So that's what we're seeing at the moment. There is also this a theoretical idea of epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice is when victims are not listened to, are not believed. And we've seen that in former Yugoslavia genocide. And it's happening especially with political actors here who are trying to show that there is something going on here in the region, but not being believed. And that has a name to it. Two things I can mention again that's changing, and we need to show that how similar it is with what happened here. In the Akayezu trial in ICTR, there was a huge discussion about children who were born between Tutsi and Hutu couple, and whether it constitutes a genocide. The ethnicity belonging to Tutsi ethnicity became questioned. But an amazing, brave judge, which I cannot remember the name, he said it is about what is in the mind of the perpetrators. And this, again, I'm bringing that example to show the similarity of what's going on. So basically, it isn't whether the victim or the Tutsi, it is what the perpetrators make of the victim. So if any Congolese Tutsi was here in 1994, he would not have been spared because he's Congolese. If there is a Rwandan Tutsi in Kinshasa, it will not be spared from lynching because he's a Rwandan. If there is a Kikuyu who may be looking stereotypically, looking at Tutsi anywhere in Congo, he will be killed. So now remove the borders and you will realize that there is that notion of what is in the mind of the perpetrator. Secondly, there is also this issues of control, the control that the perpetrators has. What I mean by control is the power. And you see again that happening anywhere, any leader who hold power and being able to use such rhetoric as means to maintain such power. So there is a control going on there. So maybe I can end there, but really the point I'm trying to make here, there isn't a journey geographically, there is a journey within history, there is internal grievances, internal causes, but same genocide. And the phenomenon of Wazalendo, as I can end with that, from that, what we're seeing in the DRC, we know that there are about over 200 armed groups. And none of those groups has a political grievance. And no any other political grievance other than we want to exterminate Tutsis. That's all what they share. And that's really, it kind of sent an alarm of what's going on in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. And just staying on you for a second, because you mentioned these unresolved historical grievances, identity-based exclusions. And yes, we want to understand the extent of the issue, and I think that's an endeavor that would take days. But thank you for highlighting some of the key elements of this issue. But I wanted to just walk with you on this society that we find ourselves in, that with historical grievances, with identity-based exclusion. If you were to imagine a coordinated regional approach, because as you've mentioned, we are all part of the same house. You cannot just isolate one room and deal with the issues and expect that the whole house will be fine. Any approach towards that has to be coordinated and regional. If you were to imagine such an approach to ending the persecution of Tutsi communities in Eastern DRC, in the region where the ideology still thrives, what steps would you imagine that should be taken at national, regional, even international levels? And as you walk us through this journey, and I understand it's a tall order, but you've done a lot of research on this and you have quite an idea. And too often we see that, the world leaders eventually, after years of turning around the issue, can somewhat come across the research that the likes of you have done, and it informs their decision and their approach. So if you were to just take us through these steps and, let us know what do you think would be the challenges that could be encountered in bringing this to fruition. Just, walk us through a solution that you find would be inclusive, build inclusive societies.
Great. Really, before I move to solutions, really, let me start by saying that when we talk about genocide and response to genocide, there is an element, legal element around exhausting and domestic mechanism. Is that how you say it, lawyers? What do you do when domestic mechanisms are part of the problem? For example, I'm again moving to the DRC. So lawyers are told, look, you have to use a national mechanism. That's one of the problems that's so difficult, and already I'm trying to move to regional mechanism, how they can be able to assist. And there is a second elephant in the room. We know that genocide is an outcome of the history, and from colonial time to post-colonial governance systems. If post-colonial governance systems have perpetuated the same issues that cause genocide, again, we have a problem. We don't have a responsible government to be able to address that issue, as we did here in Rwanda. So now there is an opportunity here. How there is not a confrontation of that legacy of colonialism? That's one opportunity that has not been really, some sort of a collaborated approach between African governments to confront the legacy of colonialism. During the Black Lives Matters, as you probably have followed this, it was triggered by a black, the brutality of police in America, which led to George Floyd death. And that really brought a discussion around decolonization and the legacy of colonialism. So inequality in a much more bigger form. And Belgium started kind of being at the center of debate. The monument of King Leopold was attacked. And from that point, Belgium tried really to kind of clean that sort of political risks and bad press. They commissioned an inquiry. I was part of the inquiry, kind of a witness, expert witness. It took about 6 months. The inquiry commissioners, they came up with this 500 pages report. There was 2 lines about the region. 2 lines. It was much more focusing on, in the northern part of Congo, but this is not the problem. We know that the problem, the biggest problem of legacy of colonialism, it is here in the region. So I do see a regional mechanism having an opportunity to confront such issue, because government itself is not responsible. That's one. There is also an international mechanism called Responsibility to Protect, which came out in 2005 in Canada. The idea of responsibility to protect was, what do you do when a country is persecuting its own people? And that law had been applied to Gaddafi, had applied to many cases in Ivory Coast. And why cannot be applied to DRC? That's the international mechanism. And for the regional mechanism, is an understanding that there is not a successful integration of regional mechanism, regional community, without eradicating the ideology that's ramping in this area. How can you do trade? We talk about trade between the countries. How would you do trade when countries are promoting hatred, fueling hatred between one group of people, between countries? That is already a problem. So going to solutions is a principle to understand that integration is not possible without such an acknowledgement. And secondly, it is really creating some kind of a legal mechanism similar to the ad hoc mechanism of ISTR, where there is an understanding the exterminations of Tutsi in Congo are endangered communities. And putting that at the agenda of a regional mechanism. Why? Because even if there's no interest in a small group being persecuted, almost, I'd often say that countries do speak about minority when the persecutor of a minority is against their interest. That's the only time powerful countries speak about minorities. But actually, it is a barrier. That tiny minority, it is a barrier to look the progress that Rwanda has made 31 years later. But it's being drawn into something going on in the DRC. That is holding the country to progress. So if we don't get rid of such an issue at the regional level and put that issue of persecution of a Tutsi minority in Eastern Congo, we have a barrier to progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's even more challenging when you consider that the same, that I call malevolent, the same malevolent colonial forces and colonial interests are still very much at play. And my next question is as to Dr. Kimonyo on this. When we talk about, the political manipulation, the neo-colonialism, which is not even that new, because it's the same actors enacting the same colonial script in the region, perpetuating this genocide ideology. And I want to give an example. His Excellency President Paul Kagame often mentions when he's commenting on the conflict in the Eastern DRC that it's a conflict between Congolese. He keeps mentioning and highlighting the fact that the M23 are Congolese. And to that he's met, I've seen it in the international reaction is somewhat dismissive of that, but then met with the same mantra, no, M23 must withdraw from the entirety of Congo. And to that, people say, well, where should they go? Because we understand this movement between the region, and this is a political manipulation of even the refugee issue. A lot of the M23 soldiers were refugees in the entire region. So how do you, as we're talking about strategies, how do we confront this political manipulation that feeds into this persistence and spread of genocide ideology when you take into account the fact that colonial powers such as Belgium are still very much stakeholders in this issue? You've analyzed the challenges that Rwanda has encountered in the national reconstruction. I'm sure you're seeing parallels in how Rwanda has addressed this. Do you see any strategies there? How can we address this issue?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to come back a bit to what I just said. I think that at the end of the day, especially for the international community and the community of states, the issue is an issue of political choice. Are you supporting the project of exterminating part of the population of a certain country or not? And this political choice seems to be detected by political and economic interests by a number of members of the international community. So I think it's clear. Relations between states is very hard and very calculating. And in spite of everything, we can see, for example, a country that is so close to the issue that we're talking about, like Belgium, acting the way it is acting. If there's a country that shouldn't act that way, it should be Belgium, because of the number of layers of responsibility that Belgium has, and starting first by the redrawing boundaries of different countries that when they created the Congo, for example, taking part of Rwandan territory. They are the ones who are responsible of that. Mr. Bizimana told us about the role Belgium played in creating the ideology of genocide in Rwanda. Very much so, it's very clear. And then in '94, there's other things that they did. Among those things, it was when their peacekeepers were killed, 10 of them were killed, they decided to orchestrate an international campaign to have the whole UN UN military mission to be withdrawn, do all of it. And as soon as they started it, what's the name again of this? It was, anyway, the mission was withdrawn because the Belgium made a protracted campaign to have the whole mission to be withdrawn. And that's when Rwanda was completely abandoned. So 41 years after that, seeing what Belgium is doing, it's beyond comprehension. But still have their way of viewing, and we have to maybe not respect it, but at least to understand that. My colleague talked about legal instruments, international legal instruments, treaties, and laws, institutions, and everything. And I think my two colleagues here also talked about that also very eloquently. But at the end of the day, if you want to combat an ideology of genocide, the burden to combat the ideology of genocide effectively is on the target of that ideology, is on the victim of that ideology. That's the most important agents and the most effective agents to combat it. Not third parties. Third party can help or support. That's possible. But at the end of the day, it is those who are firstly concerned by that should stand up. How we can help? Yes, I think that we also have a certain clarity of purpose. We should help those who are combating for their rights. That's the most effective way of combating ideology and the victims.
Thank you. And speaking of support on the actors that are combating this genocide ideology and the spread of it within the existing system, Minister Bizimana mentioned how recently, in a first for the genocide against the Tutsis in France, a person was convicted of genocide denial. And I just want to bring back to these legal systems that are in place for Florida, from Madam Kawasinga, if you can tell us, with your own expertise, legal expertise, when you look at the legal mechanisms available, both in Rwanda, in other countries, and internationally, what more could be done? If to support, of course, the people that are fighting the good fight, but also what more could be done to hold accountable those who continue to spread genocide ideology beyond Rwanda's borders, especially when you consider that in a lot of systems, these narratives are protected or even amplified under the guise of freedom of expression.
First of all, let me say something about what Dr. Ntung said. There's nothing that is happening in the DRC that did not happen in this country. Nothing. Not the rhetoric, not even the cannibalism. At the ICTR, we actually had cases where the fact that victims' body parts were actually eaten during the genocide, we had that evidence. So the same script, the same everything of what is happening in the Eastern DRC happened here in 1994. On the question of whose concern is it about ideology and perpetration, there is no way it is only an issue that concerns this country. And I'll tell you why. In 1994, this ideology was on the streets, perhaps contained within our borders, and you could say it was a concern perhaps of one jurisdiction. But how is it perpetrated at the moment? You have people that are using social media, sitting in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, and they're beaming that through YouTube and other social media into Rwanda. The fact that the language that is being used is Kinyarwanda does not mean that those countries are not concerned or should not be concerned. The intended audience, obviously, are Rwandans. So when you talk about freedom of speech is never absolute. Because our history has shown us in this country that words actually have the power to kill. And that's how it starts. So the same way genocide is perpetrated using state apparatus should be brought to bear to stop genocide ideology in the various capitals where it's happening. If you look at the statistics of who is accused of genocide denial, revisionism, minimization in this country, you will actually realize it's post-genocide generation. People who are teenagers, people who are in their early 30s, they were probably extremely young, 2, 3, 4 years old during the genocide. Why is that happening? When you see the proliferation of genocide ideology that is coming through YouTube, and you know in our country, people have smartphones, they can access this information very, very easily. And that's how you end up finding a 20-year-old killing a Tutsi neighbor who is a survivor. These are real life consequences. But how many states, in fact, have condemned this in their laws? Dr. Bizimana mentioned France. 2017, they extended the law against denial of the Holocaust to include genocides such as what happened in this country and others that have been found to have been perpetrated through UN courts and those that have been recognized by the UN. But let me tell you how countries that don't take this seriously are going to have consequences eventually. There are cities in the world where you have big concentrations of Rwandan community. I have friends in Europe that tell me when they're walking on the streets, because of this ideology, they actually say they are Burundians. They don't want to say they are Rwandans. They say, I'm from Burundi, I'm from Uganda, because it actually has consequences. If you are, let's say, on the street of London, and you have a megaphone, and you're screaming and saying, cockroaches must be hunted down and killed, it has no impact, right? People are going to think you're probably crazy and take you to a psych ward, right? But if a Rwandan hears that, what happens? Because that is an order to hunt down Tutsi and kill them. So this country has enacted laws to make sure that people are held accountable to denial, revisionism, and all of that. But if you actually go to a country in the West and you tell them this person is talking about genocide denial, it should be condemned, the words that are used are usually innocuous, right? To a Western ear. If you say, cockroaches are bad, they need to be killed, somebody's going to tell you, of course, I will hunt down a cockroach and kill it. But that's not the meaning. So we must educate people everywhere what this means. What does it mean, genocide denial? And it has real life consequences. So that's the thing that people don't understand, especially the fact that freedom of expression is not absolute. There is no law in the world that says freedom of expression is an absolute right. And in every law in every country, you actually have exceptions. Even the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights has exceptions. Even the First Amendment in the US has exceptions. And those exceptions must be contextual, okay? So that's the understanding that people need to take away and know that if you have a concentration, for example, of Rwandan community in your country, if this ideology is allowed to fester and go unchecked because of freedom of expression, you are going to have members of the Rwandan community in those cities killing each other, okay? Those are real life consequences. And so states must enact laws, because if somebody is sitting in a capital somewhere in the West and is using social media to actually do genocide denial, it becomes extremely hard for Rwanda to ask for extradition if there is no reciprocity in the laws of those states. So laws must be enacted, there must be changes in order to stop genocide ideology.
And thank you very much for highlighting this issue, that there are nuances that need to be, linguistic, cultural nuances that need to be captured by the legal frameworks of these countries where we have diaspora. And I recall a few days ago, there was a concert that was prepared in Paris. It was actually supposed to take place on the 7th of April. A concert where officially it was for the benefit of the children in DRC. However, you find that the rhetoric behind the organizers, one of them, the headliner, Maître Gims, a rapper, has just been spreading very inflammatory talk that has been met with indifference. For instance, at some point, he looked into a camera and said, it is not with orange juice that you calm the hatred of a Tutsi, mimicking gestures of a gun. And for people who are so divorced from the realities, do not understand, but there's a very large Congolese community in Europe, very large Rwandan community in Europe, and this message is quite clearly understood by who they are beaming it to. And there was, when the concert was rescheduled, because a lot of people were asking, we're not asking for you to stop it, we're asking that it be rescheduled to another date, because we understand that by choosing the international commemoration, the day of international commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi, there's another element of provocation that is happening. And in that, there was a lot of mobilization. The prefecture of Paris, the chief of police of Paris did not wake up out of the blue and decide to stop this concert. It's because of the mobilization of people that were there. And this brings me to a community, a point that is always emphasized by Ms. Wairi Munderitu, the importance of community, especially when we're talking about genocide prevention and the suppression of genocide ideology, that it has to be capable of implementation by the community. So I just wanted for you to speak a bit more on that, on the role of the community as a counterforce for this deeply entrenched hatred ideology, really. How can the community come together? How can the community be harnessed as a force to address genocide ideology?
Thank you. Thinking about community, and community in the way it can be defined in so many ways, in terms of being small community, being a large community. I think in terms of genocide ideology, I think the 31st commemoration that we're having right now provides a very pivotal moment for Rwanda. And I'm thinking of Rwanda as a community among nations in the world. Rwanda that has been such a leader on so many aspects. For Rwanda to provide leadership, lead us in a global conversation on what do policy frameworks on genocide ideology look like. Because we have this assumption that people around the world do know what genocide ideology is, like all the nuances that both of you have spoken about, like they need to be really put out there so that people then see this from that perspective. And also, in whatever communities people are in, religious communities, if you are in political parties, whatever community you are in, I think very important to underline the fact that, a genocide happened here in 1994, and that the UN General Assembly gave this genocide its proper name. And the name of this genocide is a genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. So important to pass this information to communities that we all are in. If you are in a trade unionist community, if you are in a teacher's community, to explain to everyone that if the Tutsi were not targeted for destruction in whole or in part in this country, that then no Hutu moderate would have been killed, no peacekeeper would have been killed. They were killed because the peacekeepers, the Hutu moderates, anyone who was not Tutsi, was killed because they were standing in the way of the complete annihilation of the Tutsi community. So if you are still using the words Rwandan genocide in official communication, in whatever you are doing, in normal conversation, then know that you are speaking the language of the perpetrator, you are speaking the language of the denier. So it's absolutely important that we call this genocide for what it is. If we are to speak to our humanity, the humanity that made us all say never again, and we hope this never happens anywhere again, and we know it happens again, let's call what happened, what happened. We call the Holocaust, we must call this genocide by its proper name. Its proper name is a genocide that happened against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And then in terms of communities as well, thinking of what is going on, for example, in this genocide ideology that is spreading, we are not looking at the bigger picture of artificial intelligence. What does it mean when all these false narratives keep being put out? When all these media houses, very strong media houses, are putting out false narratives on exactly what is happening? What does it mean when, again, we start blaming victims for what happened to them? What then does it mean for artificial intelligence? It means that artificial intelligence will pick up those lies, and before we know it, then this will be considered as the truth. So we have to be very, 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 we have to form a community amongst ourselves in terms of ensuring that the right ideology goes out, and that's not the genocide ideology, it's the fact of what exactly happened in this country. You know, in my previous occupation, in my previous position, I engaged a lot with the communities in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the genocide deniers of Srebrenica borrowed from the Holocaust deniers. And the genocide deniers of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, they also borrow from Holocaust deniers. Look at the arguments that they make that Florida has outlined about numbers, about where, you know, all those kind of things, and you see the similarities. And so, really, we must come together as a community that understands what genocides do, and that genocides are specifically targeted to specific people, and that those people are not targeted because they are deserving of genocide, but it's because this ideology has been built against them. So we must understand that there are people who wake up every day and what they are just putting out is denial, they are putting out inversion, they are trivializing the genocide. So we have all the legal frameworks that we've mentioned about. The African Union's Constitutive Act is very clear in terms of prevention of genocide. We have the ICGRL protocols that I mentioned earlier that require that every country in the Great Lakes region must have a committee to prevent genocide. We have all these laws and legislations, the UN, you know, all these international bodies have all these laws. However, we must put it to ourselves as communities in terms of how do we make all this operational? How do we make this come down to the ground? And then, very important, because we are here for the 31st commemoration, very important that we speak to one of the places where the ideology is so prominent, and of course I'm speaking about the DRC. It's extremely important, and Florida, you know, when you say that young people are now the ones who are being involved in genocide denial, how much do these young people know in terms of facts? Because we have to counter, we know the way the circle of socialization works. when a young child is growing up, they get their information from their families. And unless that information is countered by schools, is countered by media institutions, is countered in other spaces, they will continue going on with this information. We must speak to the fact that when a genocide happened here in 1994, that there was a huge refugee movement to DRC, and that in that refugee movement, there were quite a number of people who had participated in killing people here, who had participated in the genocide. And those people haven't been brought to account. We must speak to that. We must also speak to the fact that M23 did not exist before the 1994 genocide. That M23 began to exist when this mass movement of people went there. Among them, the 500 people who are then to be indicted, over 500 people who are then to be indicted by the ICTR, and that's when the M23 was formed. We must speak to the fact that the focus on M23 is huge and immense, yet there are more than 130 armed groups in the Kivus. Why do we not speak to those 130 or more than 100 armed groups in the Kivu? Who is benefiting from this narrative that focuses on M23? And we must also speak to the fact and not be afraid of the truth, because the truth is also that among those more than 100 armed groups, M23 is the only one that is fighting for survival. It's the only group that is fighting against an ideology. There are no other ideologies against these other armed groups. So unless we ensure that we speak facts, then it becomes almost impossible to counter what we are seeing in front of us. And so then that brings me to, what did Rwanda do when the world abandoned Rwanda to itself? Rwanda reached into itself and had conversations with itself and decided we actually had homegrown methods that could work in the current situation. We don't have to wait for somebody else to come in. So all these homegrown methods came up, and they are so impressive in terms of how to deal with each particular situation. And the video that we saw when we first came in spoke to some of those homegrown methods. And so then, now I'm speaking to the African Union, I'm speaking to the East African community, and I'm asking, when do we look into these homegrown methods of sorting out some of these issues? Because these homegrown methods will also speak to the larger problems, and the larger problems include the fact that if you go to the Kivus today, or to much of Africa, you'll find weapons that not even national armies have. Where are these weapons coming from? We know that there is an existing willing seller, willing buyer market for these weapons in this continent, but we must speak to the fact of who is arming these armed groups, who is benefiting from armed groups being armed. So we must speak to those facts. So speaking to a community approach, we are speaking to looking into ourselves and thinking. So we've been looking out to the world and trying to get solutions for what is going on. We've been trying as much as possible to bring out the issues that are happening. We've been trying to bring out these narratives, and when I say we, I'm speaking about the fact that even I, in my previous position, the things I'm saying now, I said them. I used to put out statements and say, this is what is happening. But then, the larger aspect of that speaks against the truth, that is what we must speak against, because we really must tell the truth. And let's never again means nothing. We must tell the truth. And as I said earlier, that communities who've already been targeted for genocide are 3 times likely to be targeted again. The stereotypes exist. You've heard the explanation that if you stand on a street in Europe and talk about cockroaches, nobody will understand. But those who are being called to action will understand that this is the moment to go again for a community that's been targeted for genocide. So we must reach into ourselves. This is the year 2025. We must remember what it felt like after the genocide in 1994 and ask ourselves honestly, what is it that made those who do not speak for the Tutsi today not speak for them? Really ask yourself that question. Really ask your governments that question. Really ask your governments, what is this that makes it possible to stand with perpetrators of genocide? Why would any government stand with perpetrators of genocide? So, and of course, I end by saying what I began by saying in the beginning, that if your government is protecting genocide perpetrators, it's absolutely important to ask the question, why are we protecting genocide perpetrators? People who have been indicted by an international criminal tribunal, why are we protecting them? And they are all over the world. So I've spoken specifically about the over 530 in DRC. There are many others in many other countries. And we must really, really, really ask of ourselves questions. How meaningful can the 31st commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi be if we cannot speak to the fact that we have allowed perpetrators to live free, we have allowed perpetrators to continue the genocide ideology, we have allowed narratives that are completely false to be put out against a victim community. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for those words. Quite edifying, and I would like to thank you all panelists for that, for really putting everything into perspective. The continuation of the genocide ideology entails the continuation of the genocide against the Tutsi. It merely changed locale. And because of our shared history in the region, because of our identity-based politics, right? It has enabled this genocide ideology to just merely change borders. Borders are kind of end up being meaningless in the grand scheme of things. And we have to confront this ideology as a political project, which has a lot of interested stakeholders, colonial powers, international community, which at this point, passivity is complicity to some certain extent. And we have to confront the real facts surrounding the genocide against the Tutsi, the real existential threat to the Tutsi community in the region. And when we consider the existential threat to Rwanda, we're talking about it's an existential threat to the entire regional community, really. We have to confront these facts. We have to confront and challenge the gaps and failures of the international systems and national systems in place, as so eloquently put by Florida. So I'd like to thank you. I'm going to very, very briefly, because we are very, very pressed for time, open the floor to just 2 questions. And if you have questions, to just very, very briefly ask your question, and one of our very esteemed panelists will be able to answer the question. So we have one question there, and let me identify another person who would be willing to ask a question. So, sorry. So table 14 and this gentleman there. Yes, let's start with table 14. Thank you.
My name is Innocent Nziryayo. I'm a member of collective of lawyer of Banyamulenge, Tutsi, and Hema. I'm glad to be here today. My question is about what His Excellency Minister Bizimana has made it clear that which I quote, in 2003, the UN established the obligation to commemorate the 1994 genocide against Tutsi, and this was reaffirmed by Security Council in 2014. Today, some cities in Belgium has banned public commemoration. To me, this is genocide denial. What is UN response to this? In my opinion, a commission should have been created urgently to gather all the necessary evidence in order to initiate legal action. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nziryayo. And the gentleman over there on table, I can see the table number. 13, table 13, would like to ask his question as well. So he's...
Thank you to the panelists. And deepest respect to everyone here present. We've had quite a great session of learning. And my name is Paul Uda. I serve as the student representative lead at the African Leadership University. My question here is, what concrete steps, and is directed at Dr. Alice. Yeah, so the question here is, what concrete steps can the UN take to dismantle networks of genocide, denial, and hate speeches across borders? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very pertinent question. And I think, okay, one very last question from the gentleman at the back of the venue here.
Thank you. My names are Karangwa Semnaga Marie, current president of University of Kigali.
Sorry, can you please repeat your name?
Karangwa Semnaga Marie. And also the most recent product of Inagamburuzgwa, 5th edition. And first of all, like my previous speaker said, I would like to thank everyone here, especially the guests, for this thought-provoking and awe-inspiring conversation. My question, if the panel may allow, I would like it to direct it to Florida Kabasinga, mainly emphasizing on what gaps do you see in the current legal frameworks when it comes to prosecuting genocide, denial, and revisionism. Thank you so much. That was it.
Sorry, just to clarify your question, you're asking the gaps to prosecuting here in Rwanda, genocide denial?
Yes, mainly nationally here in Rwanda, but also on an international perspective, if possible.
Absolutely, thank you. Because I think she has answered about the international perspective, but maybe she could expand a bit more. So thank you very much for all these questions. I think we're going to start with the minister who got the first question. Mr. Nhezinjayo asked about whether Belgian cities banning the commemoration could be considered an act of genocide denial. Actually, he affirms it is an act of genocide denial. And if there shouldn't be an urgent commission placed to assess and address this issue.
Bon, évidemment, je ne vais pas parler au nom de la Belgique, mais je l'ai bien dit aussi dans ma présentation, c'est une violation du droit international. Parce qu'actuellement, vous entendez souvent, même sur Twitter et autres social media, le ministre Maxime Prévost dire que la Belgique applique le droit international en ce qui concerne la demande de sanctions qu'il fait contre le Rwanda. Mais la décision du Conseil de sécurité est obligatoire pour tous les États membres des Nations Unies. Idem pour la résolution de l'Assemblée générale. Or, la décision de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies du 26 janvier 2018 stipule que tous les États sont tenus de respecter une journée, le 7 avril, de réflexion sur le génocide perpétré contre les Tutsis au Rwanda, et donc de laisser se dérouler les commémorations de ce génocide. Si la Belgique les interdit, c'est une violation totale de cette obligation qui s'impose à tous les États membres des Nations Unies. C'est ce que je peux répondre. Sinon, pour les mobiles, ils appartiennent de façon interne à la Belgique.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. On va se tourner vers les panélistes. Madame Alice Nweri Munderitu, they asked on the concrete steps the UN can take to just dismantle these genocide denial and ideologues.
So first, I can't speak for the UN because I do not work there anymore. I can only speak to what we were able to do. But also, I think it's extremely important. You know, the president of the International Residual Mechanism, IRMCT, Judge Graciela, she's in the room. If she could get an opportunity to speak, I think that would be great, because they've done so much work in terms of putting together the international residual mechanism, speaking to both the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, like taking the work forward. But I think the minister has partly answered this question, because he's spoken about the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council and the naming, of course, the International Day of Commemoration. As we speak, there are commemorations going on right now in the UN. There are commemorations that are going on at the African Union. And it was actually the UN General Assembly also that gave us the name, the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. It's a UN General Resolution. I must say that when I joined the UN, at that time, genocide denial was not something that was being addressed, like in a big way. And Holocaust denial was being addressed, and especially by UNESCO then. And when I went to Srebrenica, and then an incident there made me understand, including, of course, the Commission of Inquiry that was put together by Republika Srpska to prove that a genocide didn't happen in Srebrenica. It made me understand why we have to walk Holocaust denial alongside genocide denial, that you cannot not talk about genocide denial. And then, Gregory Stanton, Professor Gregory Stanton, who we were actually here with not so long ago, he came up with that list of what happens when a genocide is being planned, and his last, number 10, is a genocide denial. So it is, of course, expected that when you plan something of the magnitude of genocide, that then you will deny. So what we did, we came up with the first paper policy by the UN that linked Holocaust and genocide denial. It's available. If you look for it online, it's there. It speaks very specifically to recommendations of what the UN can do, what member states can do in terms of this whole aspect of denial. But I must say that the other thing that needs to happen is it's really a consistent remembrance by UN officials especially on the reasons why the UN was created in the first place, because it was created after the Second World War on the never again call. The office that I led itself was created because of what happened here, of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And actually, in the letter that was written by the Secretary General to the Security Council, then Kofi Annan, it says to avoid a repetition of the genocide that happened against the Tutsi in Rwanda, then we need this kind of office. So the mechanisms are there. The UN has the frameworks, the mechanisms, it has the offices, but of course much more needs to be done. Political will by member states, because as I think Alex mentioned responsibility to protect. Ultimately, for responsibility to protect to happen, the Security Council has to make a decision. And that decision is the veto powers in the Security Council. I can say with certainty, and I'm saying this with certainty, would almost ensure that we are not able to get another responsibility to protect. Something really needs to shift for us to get to that space where a decision can be made by the Security Council that says we recognize that people here are suffering, are being killed, are being targeted because of their identity, and they are not being protected because of our political positions. Because really, the political positions of the members of the Security Council are usually very clear in the decisions that they make. It's usually very clear that they are speaking on behalf of their government.
Thank you very much. And there's a question that was asked of you, Florida, but I wouldn't want you to just have to repeat everything that you said on the international front. But I think the question that is really asked, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, it's about, here in Rwanda, we have all these very far-reaching laws, but are they as far-reaching as they should? And in the implementation of these laws, when you're prosecuting these genocide deniers here in Rwanda, what are these major challenges that we're encountering? If you could discuss that quickly.
So the laws here are actually extremely clear, and the elements of the different crimes, denial, revisionism, minimization, the elements are very clear in there, and the jurisprudence that has come out of the courts is quite clear. But when it becomes international, and perhaps because the gentleman who asked the question is a student, I would like to elaborate to show how difficult it is, even for people who committed genocide, for us to get accountability when they are not within Rwandan borders. if there's somebody, for example, who committed genocide, who is suspected of committing genocide and is based, for example, in Johannesburg, the prosecutor in this country who is trying to get the suspect to be extradited has to understand the laws in South Africa, has to put an arrest warrant and an indictment in the language that is going to be used in the court of law in South Africa. In addition to that, the prosecutor in that country is the one who is going to go and argue the case in the court in South Africa. It's not going to be the prosecutors actually do not even have a law condemning this kind of stuff. The other thing that is a huge challenge is that in the countries where it's being perpetrated, the people that want to fight back are not equipped with the right information to actually call it out. I'll give you an example. There was a university in the region, I think it was 2 years ago. Rwandan students in that university organized a commemoration, and they sent an invite to everybody, including alumni, and said, we are going to commemorate the genocide against the Tutsi. One of the professors wrote back to everybody and said, be careful not to call it genocide against the Tutsi, because Hutus died and Twas not exclude other groups that died. And the students in that university obviously were offended, but they didn't know how to react. And if it comes from somebody of authority, it is likely to carry a lot of weight. So apart from ideologues that know the history of this country that are doing this intentionally, a lot of people that promote genocide, denialism, revisionism, and related crimes, in fact, are doing it out of ignorance, because they probably read Michaela Wrong's book or somebody like that, and they think they've figured it out. But on that group, there was an alumni, a student who had been to that university, who read this and decided to write back to everybody and create a teachable moment. And that is what people need to do. There are people that are in these spaces where this stuff is happening in the different countries, but I believe we need to equip them, to educate them with the right tools to be able to fight back. If you're fighting against denialism, against ignorance, but you yourself are not well equipped, you're not going to be successful in what you're doing. So those are the major gaps of what's going on internationally. But on the ground, because we have real life consequences, the investigators and prosecutors in this country take this seriously, and there are statistics which show different categories of these related crimes and how they are being dealt with in courts of law. So our laws are solid, and over time, because sometimes you get criticized using contexts in the Western world, you're using this to do I don't know what. There has to be an understanding that for us in Rwanda, we actually understand the consequences of this. You cannot use the context in Timbuktu to judge a context in Rwanda. Perhaps because of the history of particular countries, there are things that are condemned in those countries which we would not understand in Rwanda, because we don't know. It has not been a historical issue for us. But for us, denial, revisionism, and all of that, we know where it leads.
Thank you very much, Florida. And just one very last question, so that we can also have questions for our panelists, Dr. Kimonyo and Dr. Ntung. I understand table 25, there's a question on table 25. If you could very, very briefly just ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Gatete Nyingabo, and I'm a researcher. I have a question addressed to Dr. Kimonyo. Why is it acceptable that genocide ideology and genocide denial is accepted, encouraged even, and promoted as something enlightened, if it is framed as an opposition to the RPF-led, Paul Kagame-led government. So if you present yourself as someone who are opposed to the Rwandan government, to Paul Kagame or to the RPF, you are then given a free pass to say, and the genocide was a lie, or the genocide did not happen, or the Western media's favorite line is they have instrumentalized or sold the genocide to political ends. Why is this something that is acceptable? Would you, for instance, because you do not agree with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, do anti-Semitism, and that then is accepted and written in the media? Thank you.
Yes, maybe I'm going to repeat myself, but I think at least for a number of countries or states, the issue again is mostly an issue of political consideration. People or countries, even institutions, by the way, having positions according to their own political calculation, being with Rwanda or an institution in Rwanda. So I think that the issue is really political. Now, before I say that maybe you support or oppose the political project that is beneath this ideology of genocide, there's a third position, which is to be indifferent as well. So I think for these three possibilities, you can understand some of the positioning of states and big institutions. Unfortunately, the ethical element of it, of the whole conversation that we are having on genocide ideology, finally doesn't weight that much, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to close this panel by first thanking you, all esteemed panelists, for sharing your experience and your expertise. It's very well appreciated. I would like to thank the First Lady for being with us today. And ladies and gentlemen, everyone who was here with us today, I would like to thank you for your for being with us and listening to this and being very engaged in this conversation. So without further ado, I'm just gonna let Ayan take over. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists for this great conversation. We are now going to stretch our legs and take a breather and go to lunch. It will take place at the Fellini and Auditorium Club. Some ushers will be guiding you. And please, let's try to be back in this room at 1:30 p.m. sharp. Thank you and bon appétit.